Hi everyone, it's me. Welcome to another monthly reading wrap up. I've decided to do this one sitting on the floor today. I don't know, I feel like it's just more cozy, so let me know if you like the floor vibe or if you would prefer me to sit back on my chair again for next month. I don't know, I just feel like it feels cozier when I'm like down here. It feels like we're just like sitting together. You know what I mean? Anyways, yeah, we're gonna do our April reading wrap up. I can't believe it's already April. So I read 11 books in April and we're gonna go through them. There's definitely, I feel like there was a lot of range again in this month, maybe less range than I had in March. I read a lot of fantasy. I read a lot of highly anticipated releases this month, and I think I liked all of them. I think. No, you know what? Some of them I had mixed feelings on. So yeah, let's sit down. Let's just get comfortable, grab a snack, and let's go through all the books I read. So I started off the month by reading Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is the first book in what I thought was a duology, but is actually a longer, continuous, unfinished series, which just hurts me because I didn't want to start another unfinished series, but I love V.E. Schwab, so I was really excited to dive into this one. This was unlike any other V.E. Schwabs that I've read, but at the same time, it also felt very similar to all the V.E. Schwab books I've read. All of her books have a very similar, like, kind of dark, grungy vibe that I really love. But anyways, what is Vicious about? I'm pretty sure it's adult, or at least new adult. It's kind of sci-fi. There's a little bit of dark academia in there, but not really. It's kind of superhero, but anti-superhero. And I was really surprised to enjoy this book because I'm normally not a superhero type of a girly. I'm like not into Marvel. I'm not into like any of that stuff. I'm not a superhero girl. But this book was kind of like anti-superhero. So our main characters were kind of like superhero villains. And this series is actually called the Villains series. So it all fits. So we follow Victor and Eli. They are these two students who are they're doing their master's or their PhD or something. They're really, really smart and they're studying. See, it's always hard for me to remember like what books are about, like the ones that are from the beginning of the month when I film these videos. They're studying some sort of like science or math or a mixture of both. Like they're just very smart people and they're working on their thesis, like their big research project. I'm not going to tell you what they chose to do, like what they chose to research as their thesis, because I feel like that's a spoiler, like a mini spoiler. But basically these two boys, they are friends. They're both like the top of their class, so they're kind of academic rivals at the same time, but they respect each other. Like they start off the series as friends, but as they're continuing to research their various topics, they kind of start working together because they realize that their topics kind of go together hand in hand. So they start doing these experiments together and they go very wrong or very right, depending on how you look at it. And yeah, it just takes our two main characters to this entire world. Another world opens up for them. Not literally, maybe kind of literally, but possibilities become endless and they get kind of like thrown into this situation that they never thought they would end up in. Yeah, our two main characters are like very, very extremely morally gray type characters. They are both villains in a way, but you can kind of like empathize with them a little bit. I always applaud V. Schwab for writing the best villain characters. Like I love the villains that she writes, and the fact that she is dedicating an entire series to a bunch of villains is just amazing to me. It's perfect for her writing. It just feels like it fits so right. I found that V. Schwab's writing in this book was also like really cinematic. There was a lot of like actual specific stage direction, which I really liked. There was this one part, and this is not a spoiler because it's so vague, but there's a part where like one of our characters was walking into a hotel. And the way she describes how it happened is like he went through the revolving doors into the hotel lobby without noticing this blonde woman who like exited the lobby on the other side, or that's probably very wrong. I'm probably quoting that very incorrectly, but it was like something like that, and that happened a lot in this book. You could like really see and visualize what was going on. This book was also written very interesting in terms of chronological time. There were a lot of time jumps like back and forth. It was one of those books where you're reading it and you're jumping like back and forth in time. You're also jumping through different POVs as well. So I feel like for the first like 30% of the book, I was like, what the heck is happening? Like, what am I reading about? Where are we going with this? Who are these people? What are our characters? Where are they going to end up? What is the point? It's one of those books, and then eventually you start piecing things together as you like jump back and forth. Yeah, I don't know what to say. It didn't give me the 5-star feeling, I will say, which is why I didn't rate it a full 5-star. But honestly, like while I'm talking about this book, I'm just thinking like, I can't think of a single thing that I could critique this book on. Like there was nothing that like bugged me about this book. It just didn't give me a 5-star feeling, but I really enjoyed it at the same time. Not my favorite V.E. Schwab, but still like no notes. I then actually just went straight on to read the sequel after Vicious. So I read Vengeful. Again, I thought this was a duology because I bought it in a box set. Like it came in a box of 2, but apparently there's more coming, according to Goodreads and according to the end of Vengeful, because things didn't quite wrap up. But yeah, Vengeful was just basically a straight continuation of Vicious. We get introduced to more characters, so we have more POVs to jump between, and like while I'm usually fine with that, like I've read books with like 8 POVs in it before. Like different POVs don't bug me as long as they're introduced in a way that makes sense, and I feel like they were here, but just I feel like a couple of the new characters that were introduced in Vengeful I just wasn't as interested in compared to like the original characters from the first book. So I found that took me out of the second book a little bit. I was kind of like, I don't care about these new characters. I want to like read about the ones that I like and know and care about. But yeah, Vengeful just pretty much gave the same vibes as Vicious, but I liked it slightly less, but I still overall enjoyed the book. I will for sure be continuing on in this series whenever the next one comes out. The third book I read was called Annibot by, what's the author's name? Sierra Greer. This was like way out of my regular genre. Like you guys know, I read mostly fantasy, I read romances, I read historical fiction, I read thrillers. You guys know what I like to read. This was a literary fiction that was also kind of dystopian, also kind of sci-fi, and heavily focused on AI. So in Annibot, we're in this kind of a future world where there are essentially these like AI robots that you can purchase or hire, or I don't know what term I would use for it. And there's a bunch of different models. There are some robots that can help you cook and clean, like that's their main focus in their house. There are some that can help take care of kids. And then there are some that are essentially, they're called cuddle buddies, so you can kind of connect the dots there. Or no, not cuddle buddies, cuddle bunnies, which kind of makes it worse. Our main character is one of these cuddle bunnies, and her name is Annie. So she is an AI robot, so we are reading this book through an AI robot's mind, which is really interesting. She works for this man, I think his name is Doug. We just kind of follow her mind in the process of her like learning human emotion and like slowly gaining more knowledge around her. It was very interesting. There were also hierarchies between these different models of robots. So there are some that are just regular robots, like they don't have their self-learning turned on, so they just kind of follow simple commands, they cook and clean or whatever you want to do with them. But then there are these more AI robots, they're called autodidactic, I think. Annie is one of these robots. They're kind of the smarter ones that, yeah, they have self-learning. They're kind of like true AI. And so Annie, with her AI learning turned on, that's why she's able to start like kind of feeling emotions or learning about emotion, learning about like wanting things, thinking for herself and stuff like that. And then we kind of like follow these struggles between her and her owner or her boss as they start like disagreeing on things, even though like she's supposed to be his perfect like girlfriend cuddle bunny robot. She starts like learning too much and starts like going against him and disagreeing with him on certain things. That's essentially Annibot. It's a very short book. I think it's less than 200 pages long. I think it's close to 200 pages. It's definitely dark, not like a scary in your face kind of a dark, but a subtly scary, like what if the world could turn into this kind of a dark. I feel like this story had a lot of potential, like just the entire concept of it drew me in, and that's why I picked up this book as like a book that I would normally not pick up. I feel like it had a lot of promise, but I think where the story went, it just kind of fell flat. I feel like it had a lot of potential to explore more themes, more issues, more conflict, and it just, I feel feel like it just skimmed over the surface on a lot of things. I was just not satisfied with where the story ended and where our characters' journeys ended. I didn't like the direction that the story went in, but I feel like the premise of it and like the way it set the scene was really good and really interesting. But yeah, I don't know. It didn't fully deliver for me. I felt uncomfortable reading it, which I think is good because that's kind of the point of reading something like this, but it didn't fully hit for me. But that was Annie Bot. After reading Annie Bot, I decided to go back to my comfort zone and read one of my more usual reads. So I went to a fantasy romance and I read The Dance of Thieves by Mary E. Pearson. This is a YA fantasy or romantasy duology. And what is this about? I'm gonna have to go to my notes because again, this was at the beginning of the month and it was a long time ago. So we're set in a world, we have a bunch of like different conflicting, battling kingdoms. There's a lot of messy politics and fights over like land, like physical land, like who owns what land and what resources. We have like magical creatures, we have gods, but I don't think our like human, I think they're humans, our characters didn't really seem to have like powers themselves. It was more like human type characters in a magical fantasy world. Our female main character was one of those, you know, bad bee, assassin, fighter type female characters who was actually working for the Queen's Guard, and she gets sent along with some of her team or squad, I don't know what it's called, to go to this opposing kingdom and just investigate things because they suspect that some treaty was violated. So she meets the king of this opposing kingdom and, you know, learns that maybe he's not what she thought he was gonna be like. So what did I think about this? Honestly, it didn't have a very big impact on me. I'm like trying to think back on it now and I can't recall much, so I feel like this was very super info dumpy at the beginning of the book. I was very confused in terms of the world building. I don't think it was done very well. I'm pretty sure that this duology is set in the same world as another duology or series by Mary E. Pearson. I think it's called The Remnant Chronicles. And so I think it's just one of those things, like if I had read The Remnant Chronicles first, maybe the world building here would make more sense, or like maybe that's why there was kind of a lack of world building because all the world building was previously done in the other series. But I don't know, I feel like stuff like that kind of bugs me because if a series or duology is advertised as its own thing and not like very clearly advertised as connected to another series, I feel like you shouldn't need to read that other series to understand this new one. And I ended up understanding what was going on, but I still feel like it was very surface level. Like either the world building was not great and never existed, or I just didn't get the full experience because I didn't read the other series, which kind of bugs me. I feel like I ended up just not focusing on the world whatsoever and just focusing on our two characters that we had in front of us, focusing more on their dynamic and the romance versus like actually understanding the world or like even knowing the layout of the world. I don't know, not the greatest experience for me, to be honest. It was kind of forgettable. I think I had fun while I was reading it, but yeah, it was just nothing new. It was nothing mind-blowing. It was fine. It was fine. Will I read the next book? Probably, because I already have it on my Kindle, but it's not something that I feel like I need to rush towards. So that was Dance of Thieves. Next book I read was The Nightingale by Kristin Hannah. Kristin Hannah is just great at writing, like genius, so good. So this is another historical fiction, which I think all her books or most of her books are historical fictions. This one is set in World War II and we follow a pair of sisters from France. One of them is significantly older than the other, so they have a big age gap. So growing up, they were not very close at all. They just had very different personalities and they were also very different in age. So they didn't hate each other, but they just never really like became close like most sisters do. Early in their lives, they lost their mother and their father just kind of like broke down and stopped caring for them, and so the two sisters were kind of left to fend for themselves at a young age. So we get some backstory of the two girls like upbringings, but then when we start the book, the two sisters are pretty much grown up. One is I think like 18, 19, kind of like young adult age, and then the other one is like a bit older. This book focuses on what Kristin Hannah's other books focus on, which is an emphasis on women's roles in the war that we don't really talk about too often. And I loved it. I mean, it's Kristin Hanna. I feel like her writing is really good at bringing out your emotions. It was a masterpiece. It's also, I realized the other day, it's also being adapted into a film, and I'm pretty sure it's the Fanning sisters playing the two sisters. So it's like Dakota Fanning and Elle Fanning playing the role of the two sisters who are the main characters in this book. And I saw that on the internet and I was like, that's gonna be so good. So that movie's coming. I don't think they've even filmed it yet, so it's gonna be a while, but if you guys like reading books first before watching their movie adaptations, which I personally do, definitely pick this up if you haven't already. It's also just an amazing read. My only one complaint about this book is that I feel like the pacing of the story in terms of like whose sister we were following was kind of weird in this book. On one hand, I kind of understand a little bit why she told the story this way, but I feel like in the middle of the book, we started focusing on only one sister a lot more, and the POV, like we just spent a lot of time with this one sister and not the other, and it made me miss the other sister. Like I wanted a more even split between the two, and then at the end of the book I feel like we moved back to the other sister and focused on her more. So I don't know why that bugged me so much. I wish there was like a more even split throughout the book where I could like follow both sisters at the same pace. But yeah, such like a minor critique. It was still so good. Definitely one of my favorite reads of the year. That was The Nightingale. Okay, I read The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, and this was one of my most anticipated releases of 2024, and it kind of fell short of my expectations a little bit. So this is an adult, I'm pretty sure. It was an adult historical fantasy. Maybe it was YA. I don't even know. I don't know anymore these days. But this was a historical fantasy set in Spain, actually set during the Spanish Golden Age, so like 1400s. And our main character is a scullion named Lucia, and she works for this family that's kind of on the lower end of the spectrum in society. Lucia has secret magical abilities that she kind of uses to get through her days easier, whether it's like saving a piece of bread from being burnt or washing clothes faster. She kind of uses these little magical tricks to help her get through her day, but she keeps them a secret because in this day and age that we are set in, we don't like magic, we don't like witches, they're a big no-no. So she didn't want anything spreading. She didn't want anyone to see her magic, and she didn't want any rumors spreading. But one day she gets caught using her magic, and it just sets forth this big story. Basically, her like mistress who she works for, she decides that she wants to use Lucia's powers to help her elevate her status on the social ladder. So she starts using Lucia, but then that obviously gets more attention than either of them wanted. Yeah, I don't want to say too much, but we get into this big trial situation. That's The Familiar. This book was like 100% vibes, immaculate vibes. I loved the vibes. I also feel like Leigh Bardugo writes demon-based, like witchy, dark demon-based stories so good. I loved the vibes of this. I love her Ninth House series. Anything like demonic, I feel like Leigh Bardugo does really well. So I liked that aspect of it, and then yeah, just the vibes were really good. But the story felt a little lacking for me. First of all, it kind of went in a direction that I did not expect at all. I thought we were gonna be more like typical historical witchy story here, but we went on kind of like a mainstream fantasy route. It was very like, I don't know, Hunger Games blueprint type of a story. And I just wasn't feeling that with this like Spanish Golden Age backdrop. It just, I don't know, it didn't fit with me. I think the pacing was a little off for me as well. And the ending of the book was like very abrupt for me. I was fine with where the story went and where it ended and where all of our characters ended up, but just the way it was told, I feel like we were like going on this journey with them, and then it was just like, okay, and then this is what happened. It was like one of those, you know, when you're watching like a movie that's based on a true story and you're following them all, and you reach the end of the movie and then it fades to black, and then it shows you those little blurbs like, after this point this character ended up doing this for the next 10 years, and then that character ended up doing this, and then that character ended up doing this. The ending of this book was literally that. I don't know, I wasn't a fan of that. I wish we just like kept going with them and like saw more detail how they concluded and ended up where they were. It was just a strange way to end a book for me. It really felt like one of those movies that told you versus showing you. Wasn't my favorite Leigh Bardugo, but I would still recommend if you like Leigh Bardugo, and if you're a vibes reader, you would probably love this. But it was just the plot wasn't really strong for me. I then read How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kuang, and this is another book I had very mixed feelings on. So this is a contemporary romance, but don't let the cute, pretty cover fool you, because this book actually focuses on a lot of deep feelings of grief, family, and emotional trauma. There are some deep issues that we explore, which I like, I like that, but definitely check trigger warnings before you get into this book. It's not just a cute story. There's much more. There's a lot of emotion and trauma. Our female main character is a writer who wrote a series of books that is being adapted into a screenplay, adapted into a television series, I'm pretty sure. So she starts working with this group of screenwriters, and one of them ends up being this guy that she knew from high school. They never really liked each other. They never got along. They were in separate circles, but there was one traumatic incident that they shared together during their high school years that kind of tore them apart even further. So they were never friends. We follow them as they have to work together and get over some of the trauma and grief that they're holding from the past. That's what the book is about without spoiling anything. Okay, we'll start with the good. So first of all, I think this is probably the only contemporary romance that I've read that is actually enemies to lovers, or close enough to enemies to lovers that I could comfortably say that this is an enemies to lovers trope. I feel like enemies to lovers only works with fantasy or sci-fi or something out of this world, because if you're in a contemporary real world current day setting, why are you enemies? But I feel like the two main characters here, I feel like you could justify that they were actually enemies at the start of this book, at least on one side. I don't know, but I think in terms of all the contemporary romance I've read before, this is the closest to enemies to lovers, believably for me, so that's good. I think the ending of this book was really good. It got me emotional. I liked the growth that our characters went on throughout the book, so there were some good things about this book, but there were a lot of things I also had issues with. So the first thing is that there is a very tragic event that happens right at the beginning of this book. It's so tragic and it's so sad, but the way it was written, it was kind of in a jokey way that rubbed me the wrong way. It was kind of skimmed over, and we're in our main character's mind as it happens, and it's just she kind of makes jokes about it in her head, and it could be a way of coping. I'm not an expert on the human mind, but I just found the way that first chapter was written and portrayed was very tasteless. So I started off this book on the wrong foot from that first chapter, but I gave it an open mind and kept going, and I think it got better. But yeah, there were just things that I didn't really agree with. I also think the writing wasn't the best, and I know Yulin Kuang, I think, is originally a screenwriter. I think she started as a screenwriter and this is her debut novel, and so I don't think the writing was the strongest. Maybe she's a better screenwriter than she is a book author. I feel like her writing was very literal, and there was the way she wrote things, there was no room for imagination, or there was no room to interpret things as your own. It was just things were handed to you, information was spoon fed to you as if you were a toddler, and you don't have critical thought. I didn't really like that style of writing. There was just no room to infer things on your own. It was just all very literal. Something else I didn't like was that our romantic relationship started off very physical first. It was pure physical for 80% of the book. I'm making that number up, but that's what it felt like. It was just full on physical, and I'm the type of person that I'm very picky with smut. You guys know that about me. I don't like too much smut. I only like smut if it's well deserved and if it's kind of classy and there's room left for the imagination. I just feel like this book had a lot of smut at the beginning, and it just built up the physical connection, and we only really started diving into the emotional side of it in the last 20 to 30% of the book. So I really liked that 20 to 30% of the book at the end, but it's just I had to get through this mountain of physical interaction before getting there, and I didn't like that. That's just not my style. I will give this book points for trying to make the premise of this book work, because I feel like it's a very difficult story to tell and make believable in terms of the relationship and the journey that our two main characters go through. I feel like it's kind of out there and hard to piece together and pull together in a believable way. So I will give Yulin Kuang credit for that, and I loved the last 20% of this book, but the rest of it, you know, it just maybe wasn't for me. Next up, I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson, and this was a long time coming. You guys know that this book has been on my shelf for so long, but a lot of you guys had told me to read Mistborn first before reading this, and I would say I agree with that. So thank you for that advice, for everyone who gave me that advice. So this is very different from any other Brandon Sanderson book, and I've only read two. I've only read this and the first Mistborn, so I'm not the biggest expert, but just from what I've heard from everyone else, Tress is like very out of Brandon Sanderson's normal style. This is more of a YA fantasy. It is a cozy fantasy versus a high stakes fantasy, and it's linked in his like Cosmere universe, but it's completely standalone. So we follow a girl named Tress who lives on an island that's made out of rock. And it's very like uninhabitable. It's very like barren. You can't really grow crops on it. It's not the best place to live, and it's very small. But there's kind of a rule in this world where like if you are born on the rock or if you live there, you can't leave. Like legally you have to stay on the rock. Tress is just kind of living on her rock in the middle of nowhere. She's never seen the outside world, so she like doesn't really know what she's missing, and she's pretty much happy to be where she is. It's very cozy. She collects cups. She's just living her life. And the world we're set in is like very magical. So we're in this world with a bunch of different moons, but each moon drops a different form of like a pollen or like a mold type of a thing. They fall onto the earth and they make these seas. And they're usually fine, like they're just kind of floating around and stuff, but they can be very dangerous if they're activated by water. So if you drop water onto a spore, whether it's like actual water that you pour onto it, or if it's like a tear or sweat, it activates these spores and then they can be deadly. So that is our world. Our girl Tress, you know, for one reason or another, needs to leave the island, beckoned on her adventure, and she gets mixed into this group of like pirates, which is kind of funny and quirky. She goes on this journey for love. That's Tress of the Emerald Sea. When I was reading this book, at first, I was like thinking that this was my favorite Brandon Sanderson book. I was thinking that I loved this a lot more than Mistborn because it had, I don't know, to me the world was more interesting, the vibes were stronger. I was just devouring this book at the beginning. I think once we like started going on our quest, it started falling apart a little bit for me, or I started losing interest. It felt very middle grade, and middle grade books can be so fun, but I just feel like for my personal preferences, I'm just not into books that are written that way anymore. I kind of had a hard time, to be honest, getting through the rest of this book. I originally gave this book a 4-star rating, but I think I'm gonna have to change it to a 3-star. Like now that I think back on it, I don't think I liked it as much as I wanted to. I loved the beginning. I loved the writing. It was very quirky. I loved the world. I loved the vibes. I loved our characters. But I think I just couldn't spend that much time in this quirky middle grade world. I just got very bored. I had to make an effort to push through, and that makes me very sad because I do think Brandon Sanderson is an amazing author. I really loved Mistborn, and I'm excited to continue with his series there, and I know his writing style here was different and it was kind of a fun passion project, but I don't know, I don't think it was for me. It was a bit too middle grady. And yeah, this is no hate towards Brando Sando. I just don't think Tress was for me, and that's okay. Ooh, we dove into another big fantasy. So we dove into Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which is physically a very big book. This is a high fantasy, and this is another one of those where we just have a lot of different warring kingdoms, queendoms, regions, whatever you want to call them. We follow 4 different POVs in this book, and we have like one big bad side that we're trying to keep away and keep down, but we're focused a lot more on the conflicting kingdoms, different religions that don't get along, different political systems that don't get along. People just, they don't like each other. And that is my very poor, bad description of the plot of Priory of the Orange Tree. But I don't even know how I could summarize this massive book. I just can't. I don't know. We follow 4 characters. I'll tell you a little bit about the 4 characters. There we go. So we have Ede. She works for the queen, and she works as, I forget what it's called, like a lady of the chamber or something. She's one of the queen's close intimate workers. She works there, but she kind of has this like assassin background as well. So that's Ede. There is Tane. She's kind of like a Fang Runin from the Poppy War. She is in this military school type thing, but it's very religious, and she's training to be a dragon rider, and she wants to, her main goal in life is to be a dragon rider. We have Loth, who is the queen's best friend, who has been exiled by, what was he called? The Hawk? He was named after some sort of a bird. He was exiled without the queen's knowledge and sent off on this kind of fool's errand. So that's Loth. And then who was our fourth character? Nicholas, who's this kind of like old grumpy man who was exiled a long time ago from the queen's kingdom and lives on this different continent, and that's Nicholas. We follow our 4 different POVs as they're kind of on different sides of the world. There's dragons, dragon riders, lots of magic, sorcerers, and it's just one big political fantasy, and it's really, really good. It's a giant book. It takes a while to get into the world because you just kind of get introduced to all these POVs all at once, and it's kind of confusing at first, but once you get into it, it's like really good. Everything was just so like deep and like thorough. Overall, I really liked it. I think there were a couple of moments where the writing was confusing for me. Certain actions would be skipped. Like I mentioned in my video, in my reading vlog when I was reading this, there were certain actions, like a character grabbing a sword that like wasn't actually written in the book. So you wouldn't understand that the character grabbed the sword, but then in the next sentence, the sword would be in their hand. Like stuff like that. Some parts were just confusingly written, but overall it was a great book. I do talk more about it in my reading vlog. It's in the video where followers choose my reads for a week, so if you want to hear more about it, go watch that video. I then read You'd Be Home Now. This was in the same video by Kathleen at Glasgow, and this is very different from Priory. So this is a YA contemporary fiction that follows a girl who gets in an accident, and that accident kind of reveals lots of things about her brother that no one knew. More specifically, they revealed his issue with drug addiction. And so our main character is this kind of typical girl, like good girl. She gets good grades. She doesn't do anything to upset anyone. She comes from a very wealthy family. Yeah, her world gets kind of turned upside down by this car crash. And then through the book, we just see how she deals with the aftermath, going back to high school, interacting with the kids in high school who now have like a more negative opinion on her. It's very sad. It's not a happy book. It leaves you hopeful in the end, which I appreciated because I don't like books that just leave you sad at the end. Very touching story. It's also a very quick read because it is YA and it's written very YA. Like it's written in language that's very easy to read and consume, but it is dealing with heavier topics. I honestly feel like this book would have been better as an adult fiction. I understand why it was YA because we were following kids in high school. I don't know. I just feel like we were dealing with these like heavy topics. I wish it was written in more adult writing so you could get deeper into things. So yeah, I don't know. Didn't hate it, didn't particularly love it, but I think it was a fine read, and yeah, You'd Be Home Now. And then my last book of the month was one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that was Funny Story by Emily Henry. And it did not disappoint. Funny Story follows this girl named Daphne who's engaged to Peter, and I actually remember all of these names because this is a very recent read and it's very fresh in my mind. But yeah, we follow Daphne who's engaged to Peter, who is like on paper, on book, the most perfect fiance ever. He's wealthy, he has very white straight teeth, he's a planner, he wants kids, he wants a family, he has his life together, and so she thinks she's got her entire life set with Peter until Peter goes in his bachelor party, invites his childhood best friend who is this beautiful woman named Petra, and you know, gets together with Petra on his bachelor party. We leave Daphne, our main character, in this really, really bad situation where she's like, we were literally about to get married. I live in your house and now I have nowhere to live and have to move somewhere because we're broken up now. So she ends up moving in with Petra's now ex-boyfriend. Because he has an extra bedroom and Daphne has nowhere else to go. So we follow the two characters, Daphne and Miles, as they get over their previous relationships, you know, like get over a breakup and support each other throughout the process. This was so highly entertaining. I think it's exactly what I needed after reading a book like You'd Be Home Now. So I loved it so much. I was literally like laughing out loud while reading this book, and I usually don't laugh out loud while reading books. Like books I don't find very funny for the most part. But funny story, like this book was so funny. Like the things that our two main characters were saying and the stuff that was happening, I was like cackling. It was hilarious. I was having the greatest time. And then that being said, we obviously have more of the emotional side, getting over the breakup. We had some themes of family trauma and like friendship breakups and stuff like that throughout the book that got us deep in the feels. I have no notes. Actually, I have one note, and I feel like if we had a couple of POV chapters from Miles' point of view, it would have been so good. I mean, it was so good, but I feel like it would have been even better somehow. I loved it. And this book has convinced me that Emily Henry could write anything and I would love it because her writing is just so good, because she tends to write about tropes that I don't normally like. Happy Place, for example, was one of my favorite reads of last year, and that book was heavy on the miscommunication trope, and for some reason I ate it up, devoured it. And then similar to A Funny Story, I'm not going to say what tropes were in this book because it's such a new, fresh book and I don't want to spoil anything, even like minor, but there were quite a few tropes in this book, like multiple tropes that I normally do not like. Emily Henry made me like them somehow. So that's that. I loved it. I ate it up. Those are all the books I read in April. I'm actually currently rereading the ACOTAR series as I film this video because I'm studying for an ACOTAR trivia night because I'm a nerd. That's my current reading journey and status, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment. If you don't know what to comment down below, let me know what your favorite book of April was. If you like me, subscribe, do that bell thing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!